If you are thinking about designing a really good anonymous communication protocol, I have bad news for you. The news is that anonymity always comes with a cost. And to see why, let's have a look at how anonymous communication protocols. Where is the clicker? Let's have a look at how anonymous communication protocols work. So suppose Alice is a whistleblower in a company and she wants to make some company documents public because the company is doing something wrong. And that's why she wants to send the documents to Eve, who works for a news agency. But she doesn't want anyone in the internet or even Eve to know her identity, because probably Eve is paid by Donald Trump secretly. That's why she wants to hide under the traffic of a set of users and to protect her identity. And that's why she wants to use some anonymous communication networks. A simple way would be rerouting the message through several servers. So Alice uses server 1, 2, and 3 to reroute her message to Eve. And so Eve only knows that server 3 sent the message, but doesn't know the actual identity of Alice. By the way, this is a technique used by Tor as well. However, suppose server 1 and server 3 are malicious, is controlled by the adversary. Then they can do a lot of things, like they can compare the incoming traffic and outgoing traffic pattern, and or they can check the timing of the incoming traffic or outgoing traffic and know that Alice is the sender of the message. And how do you prevent that from happening? So for that, what you can do, server 1 can wait for several messages. When server 1 receives at least a threshold number of messages, then only server 1 forwards those messages to server 2, and so on. So in this case, Alice can hide among all those messages because server 1 is waiting for the threshold number of messages. However, since server 1 is waiting for the messages, it introduces some latency overhead. And to avoid those latency overhead, what the protocol can do, the protocol can instruct the user to send dummy messages when they don't have actual messages. And that in turn increases bandwidth overhead. So now we are faced with a trilemma. So you have either you can go for anonymity or latency, or anonymity or bandwidth overhead, or you lose anonymity. So this question is asked by the communities for since many years. Can we achieve strong anonymity without introducing large latency or bandwidth overhead? And in our work, and also we are going to, in our work we prove, or we are going to argue in the next few minutes of the talk, that when we want to limit the latency overhead or bandwidth overhead under some constant insecurity over parameter eta, we cannot achieve strong anonymity. We have to introduce some latency overhead or bandwidth overhead to actually achieve strong anonymity. Now the next question is, how much latency or bandwidth overhead should we introduce? What should be a good trade-off between the latency or bandwidth overhead? For example, given a limit on latency overhead, what is the minimum bandwidth overhead that we need to achieve strong anonymity, and vice versa? Also, further in the line, we want to answer the question, given a limit on latency and bandwidth overhead, what is the best anonymity that a protocol can achieve? For example, if we don't want strong anonymity, we are happy with weaker anonymity, but we want efficiency, then we want to know, given the latency and bandwidth overhead, how much anonymity we can achieve. Probably you're already thinking what exactly meant by strong anonymity. So let's try to formally define that. In this talk, I'm going to focus on sender anonymity, but in our paper, we also derive results for recipient anonymity. We borrow the definitions from AnoA framework. It's an indistinguishability-based definition where Alice or Bob send a challenge message, and the adversary Eve has to determine or identify who actually sent the challenge message. Also, you can look at the network traffic and all. And the adversary loses if the probability that the adversary guesses the challenge user correctly is less than the probability that the adversary guesses the challenge user wrongly, and plus some buffer delta. And then we say the protocol achieves anonymity limited to delta. And if delta is negligible in security parameter eta, then we are saying the protocol achieves strong anonymity. Now let's look at how we measure bandwidth and latency overhead. So in our work, we measure time in terms of rounds. So latency overhead is the number of rounds a message can be delayed by the protocol before being delivered. So since everything is happening in round, in this example, Alice wants to send a message to Eve, and there are 3 intermediate servers in the way. So she has to the message has to take 3 extra hops to reach Eve. So we are saying the latency overhead is 3. And suppose in each round, the protocol adds 2 noise messages. Then we are saying the bandwidth overhead is 2 over n, where n is the total number of users. So basically, the bandwidth overhead is the total number of noise messages added by the protocol per user per round. So basically, it's the dummy message rate. Now let's give you an idea how easily anonymity can be broken. Let's construct a simple adversary against anonymous communication protocols. In this, for this simple adversary is we are considering global passive adversary, and this adversary can observe all the links, and the recipient is also compromised, and it looks at the path, all the paths that messages travel through. So and it check reachability, like is this possible for this user to send this message? And remember, we are talking about indistinguishability games. So in this case, Alice and Bob, the messages from Alice and Bob travels through completely disjoint paths. So the adversary can easily identify which message is sent by Alice and which message is sent by Bob. However, if there is a link between 4 and 2, then the adversary is confused. Also, we are considering a simple adversary which doesn't calculate probability that which path can be more probable. It says there is a chance that this user can send message, so yeah, there is a possibility, so I'm confused. However, the adversary can compromise some of the nodes. For example, if the adversary compromises node 4, then the adversary can correlate the links between the incoming and outgoing links, and the adversary knows that the Bob's message actually traveled through 4, 5, and then Eve, not like 4, 2, and 3. So that's how the adversary can recognize. And against this adversary, what is an obvious requirement for anonymity? For example, is Alice sends a message at T0, and it is received by Eve at R. We are looking at the band time range. If you look at the timeline, we are looking at the time R minus L to R, where L is the limit on latency overhead. If Bob sends a message, if Bob doesn't send a message within that range, then it has to be Alice. Bob cannot send a message. The message is not possible to be sent by Bob. So Bob has to send a message from R minus L to R. And what else? Also, suppose Bob sends message T1 and T2. So the Alice's message has to meet Bob's message at some honest node within the time T1 to R. So with this obvious requirement for anonymity and this simple adversary, we derive the following bound, where the product of latency and bandwidth overhead has to be at least half. And that too against a non-compromising adversary, which means it doesn't compromise any of the protocol parties. So it's a parabolic graph. So if we plot in log-log scale, it looks like a straight line, but it's actually parabola. And the gray area below the curve is where the anonymity is impossible. So as a protocol designer, if you want to achieve strong anonymity, you should try to keep your protocol above the curve. So, but if you want efficiency but if you also want efficiency, but you want strong anonymity as well, then you try to be as close to the curve as possible, but still keep being above the curve. However, the requirements become stricter if the adversary can compromise protocol parties. For example, if the adversary can compromise all the protocol parties, anonymity is trivially broken. All the parties are compromised. So basically, the adversary knows who is sending message to whom. However, if the adversary can compromise a large number of protocol parties, but not all protocol parties, then we say the latency cannot be constant, no matter the bandwidth overhead. The latency has to increase with the security parameter. However, if the adversary can compromise only a few protocol parties, then the latency overhead can compensate for the number of compromised parties. Here C is the number of compromised parties. And these constraints are additional to the constraint that we derive in non-compromising case. Also, now you are thinking, what if the users are sending a lot of messages? Yes, that actually can help anonymity. If the users are sending a lot of messages, that can compensate for the bandwidth overhead. For example, if the users are sending message at the rate p prime per user per round, then to achieve strong anonymity, we need this requirement. So where it is basically the rate of users sending messages is compensating the bandwidth overhead. However, till now, we have only talked about strong anonymity. What if you say, I want efficiency, I'm happy with some weaker version of anonymity. In our paper, we also derive anonymity as a function of latency and bandwidth overhead. So given a limit on latency overhead L, bandwidth overhead beta, and user message rate P, we derive this bound on delta. We are calling it adversarial advantage. And we say adversarial advantage will be at least this. If you want a lower adversarial advantage, it's not possible with this latency and bandwidth overhead. Actually, in our project website, we show some cool 3D interactive plots where we can play with the plots. So probably you want to visit our project website for cool stuff. So the major takeaways from this talk. First, anonymity comes with a cost, either in the form of latency or in the form of bandwidth overhead, or both. And if the adversary can compromise some protocol parties, that actually makes it difficult for the protocol. So the cost of the anonymity increases. And as we have seen in the previous slide, sometimes user behavior can compensate for bandwidth overhead. So also, by the way, I am presenting a poster about this topic in the poster session, if you are not already bored enough about the topic. Now, with that, I'll conclude my talk. I'll be happy to answer questions.
So please come, ask your questions. A question from me. I really like your graph and how you put the existent systems in the light of your framework. But now, how can we use your framework to improve these systems? Can this be used to optimize our design, either for creating a new system or to improve a system such as Tor that fares very badly according to your framework? Can we use your framework, your formal definitions, to find out what is the best way of protecting these networks?
In our work, we do, in the paper, we do describe an ideal protocol, but that's in the ideal world. We are still working on how do we actually model a real protocol from that ideal protocol. But yeah, we do indicate that if a protocol wants to achieve some amount of anonymity, what should be the at least latency and bandwidth overhead. So the protocol designer should start from thinking that I want this much anonymity, so I cannot go below this latency and bandwidth overhead. So I have to start from this. That is the current paper indicates. That is the current paper. Yeah, that is what the current paper indicates. Okay. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you. Questions? Please state name and affiliation.
Hi, I'm Matt Van Gundy, Cisco. I enjoyed your talk. So we know that already that Tor isn't secure if you have a globally passive adversary. Could you comment on why you chose a globally passive adversary and whether or not you considered more limited adversaries as well?
Can you repeat your question?
Can you comment on why you chose a global passive adversary for your analysis and whether or not you also considered more limited adversary models?
Even if you don't have a globally passive adversary, still Tor can be insecure. The main idea is that the entry node and exit node has to be compromised. So you don't always require a globally passive adversary. You don't always require a global adversary. Even limited adversaries can attack Tor. So we don't know how limited can we go. That's a difficult question to answer. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, somewhat, but also, were you choosing a global passive adversary in order to, like, basically have a very strong assumption for the strong anonymity analysis?
I don't really.
Maybe we can discuss it offline.
Yeah, sure.
Vincent Cheval, INRIA. I had a question concerning how you model the latency, because you were considering the number of hop in your graph.
Yes.
But from the point of view of the attacker, the one just, it looks only one node, can he seize the latency, how many hops a message needed to arrive at its point?
Yes, the attacker can see all the links between all the servers and users.
Yeah, but when you say he can see all the links, does it mean that he has the knowledge of the complete graph, like in Thor?
Yes, he has the knowledge of the complete graph.
Or can he see all the traffic within those servers?
He can see that there is some traffic between server 1 and server 2, but he cannot see the content of the traffic.
Okay, but in that case, how do you take into account that messages does not start at the same time? Alice and Bob can send different message. It's continuous process. So even if you see, can you link one message to another, one message from another in different server?
Yes, if the Alice and Bob, the messages from Alice and Bob take completely disjoint paths. It's an obvious recognition that which message is sent by Alice and which message is sent by Bob.
For path, yeah, I understand, but for the time delay, I'm not sure. Because time delay is fast. Okay, no, that's fine.
Okay, if you have further question, you can take that offline.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Robert Licho from MIT Lincoln Lab. Very interesting talk. So I had kind of a follow-up question to the first question. So have you at all looked at the cost of the actual number, in terms of the actual number of nodes that you may need to have in the network to use and achieve certain anonymity guarantees, and if this somehow could relate to the cost of the attacker?
We do look at the cost from theoretical perspective. We say if the latency overhead is this much, bandwidth overhead is this much, you can achieve only this much anonymity.
Right. Do you at all, or have you at all thought about the actual number of nodes in the network? So this would be obviously network dependent, the anonymity network.
Yes. In case of, for non-compromise scenario, when the adversary does not compromise any protocol parties, the numbers are independent of the total number of protocol parties in the network. But in compromise scenario, it is dependent on the total number of protocol parties, and we do have analysis on that.
Okay, is that in this paper, or is that something?
Yes, that is there in this paper.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions, let's thank our speaker again.